Welcome to Risking Enchantment, a podcast about art, beauty, and the Catholic faith. Hosted by Rachel Sherlock. Hello and welcome to Risking Enchantment. For this week's episode, you've got myself, Rachel Sherlock, and joining me once again is Phoebe Watson.
Hello.
Good to have you back on the show, Phoebe.
Good to be back again.
And for this episode of the podcast, we're talking about the uplifting and wholesome topic of death.
Yay!
So, this is quite a heavy topic that's come from quite a light-hearted place, surprisingly enough. A couple of weeks ago, I found myself watching, for the first time, I'd never seen it, a frilly live-action Disney movie from the 90s called Tuck Everlasting, which I had heard relatively good things about, so I thought it would make for some, relaxing evening viewing. And little did I know, a podcast topic was just around the bend.
I mean, you suspected it so little that I wasn't even with you watching it, and I had to watch it separately, which most of the stuff we watch is together.
Yeah.
Because there's not that much time we have to watch stuff outside of that.
No, we don't watch very much TV, so we kind of put everything to good use, if that makes sense.
You have to maximize it.
And it was a delightful movie. I don't necessarily have super strong feelings on the movie. It was enjoyable and pretty and lighthearted. It's for, I would say, kind of preteens. It's about I think she's 15-year-old girl in, is it Edwardian times? They wear a lot of white lace.
Yeah, but it's also American, Midwest, sort of.
Yeah, so I guess I'm thinking in English terms. But let's just say near the start of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And it is about this girl, Winifred, and she's being threatened with being sent off to boarding school and all of the usual tropes of that era. But she meets a young, handsome boy who turns out to be immortal, and they fall in love, and it's what happens then. And him and his whole family have drunk from the water from the fountain of youth, and so have stayed the same age for, I think it's 107 years, which is all nice, unoffensive stuff. It was fun. But what kind of made me think was that, in a weird way, it did strike me that the movie is sort of an inverse of Twilight, the young adult novels that were a phenomenon of my teenage years, which I did read at the time, but I haven't revisited. And I'm going to make some comments on those books, but I have no particular wish to revisit them, so they may be inaccurate.
We're not going to revisit them. We're also not going to slam them. They were what they were.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of hyperbole about them, but they're also seeing a bit of a renaissance at the moment, which I think is unmerited.
That is not merited.
But if anyone has managed to escape what Twilight was, it was almost essentially the same story, except the boy involved was immortal because he was a vampire, and so there was lots of, exciting, thrilling moments. Or rather, I kind of wish there were more of them. There was a lot of the main character being quite petulant and boring. But
they're also the weirdest form of vampires ever.
Yeah.
But that is not part of this podcast, really.
No.
The point being that Tuck Everlasting, when she's offered to drink from the Fountain of Youth at the end, she makes the decision not to drink.
Yeah.
And chooses to go back to live a mortal life and to take on that change, which is, like we said, the antithesis of Twilight and Bella choosing to be a vampire and choosing that immortality and that unchanging state.
Yeah, and there was a couple of just small points in it, although perhaps I should have said spoiler alert for, hey.
Whoops, sorry.
But there's a couple of things we're going to be talking about that we'll flag with spoilers, but yeah, for that one, I mean, like I said, I don't think it's the most revolutionary movie in the world. I'm not that concerned whether I've spoiled it for you or not. But but one of the things that I did think was interesting about it was that there was a couple of mature points about it. So essentially, at the climax of the movie, the family gets found out. The Tuck family, who are immortal, have been kind of found out, and so they must move away for at least a period of time, and they must be separated from the young protagonist girl. And so, the boy that she's fallen in love with has said, drink the water and I'll come back for you. And so he comes back at the end of the film to find it's almost 100 years later, and he finds not her, but her grave. And it is a very poignant ending, I thought, because in a lot of ways, especially for teenagers, I thought it brought up a lot of quite mature themes, like the way that it also indicates that she was married. It says it on her gravestone that she was a grandmother, a mother, a wife. And then there's a second, she now has a double barrel surname, so we can infer from that. But it doesn't introduce her potential future husband during the film. It's not a love triangle, unlike Twilight. She just, without having any promise of the future, knowing that she really loves this boy Tuck, but without knowing what the future will hold, she still chooses the future, which at that point for her is just a blank canvas, and she doesn't know what's going to come. She's not choosing anything concrete. She's just choosing a potential future in which she has, the cycle of life as it's supposed to be, rather than being stuck in this stasis of being immortal and being the one age forever. And I thought that was quite mature, and it just really struck me as quite a meaningful way of looking at immortality.
Yeah, definitely. It's based on a book by Natalie Babbitt, and which essentially follows the exact same plot, except that she's a bit younger and it's a little bit more rural and less like posh Edwardian. So you just lose some of the pretty costumes. But you don't get to see them in the book anyway. But yeah, the family spends some time, the Tuck family this is, talking to Winnie about their immortal state, and actually the burden that it is on them, and their desire for change, and the sorrow that it is to them to be stuck from that. So I was just going to read a little bit of that. It's a very short book if you want to go and check it out. "Know what this is all around us, Winnie?" said Tuck, who's the father of the family, his voice low. "Life, moving, growing, changing, never the same 2 minutes together. This water, you look out at it every morning and it looks the same, but it ain't. All night long it's been moving, coming in through the stream back there to the west, slipping out through the stream down east here. The water's always moving on, and some day, after a long while, it comes to the ocean." "It goes on," Tuck repeated, "to the ocean. But this rowboat now, it's stuck. If we didn't move it ourselves, it would stay here forever, trying to get loose, but stuck. That's what us Tucks are, Winnie. Stuck so's we can't move on. We ain't part of the wheel no more. Dropped off, Winnie, left behind. And everywhere around us, things is moving and growing and changing. You, for instance, a child now, but someday a woman. And after that, moving on to make room for the new children." I think that's just like a really important reminder of what that wheel and cycle of change looks like. The consequence of the life we live here on Earth and the ability to change and grow is death. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that being tied up a little bit in the fall, and also, but yet also a gift of God to man. Yeah. But right now we're just going to focus on that idea as it's shown in Tuck Everlasting, I guess.
Yeah, because I think, this episode should come out just towards the end of Lent. I think it's a very appropriate Lent topic. I think we're looking at death through quite a lighthearted lens. We're going to be pulling from some of our favourite books, and, it's not necessarily a very heavy look at the, real burden that is the reality of grief and pain and death in the world. That's obviously a very, you can take a much more serious angle, believe it or not.
Really? I thought this was a solemn angle we were taking, Rachel.
But no, but I think that there's something interesting, which is that I know for the Benedictine monks in the Order of Saint Benedict, I know one of the kind of instructions with that life is to always have death before you. And that can sound like a very morbid way of thinking, but I think there's a whole host of different ways in which we can contemplate death and face up to its reality or interact with its reality in our world. And at different stages in our lives, we will be called on to take varying degrees of the burden of that element of our lives. But that doesn't mean that it always has to be in this very, very heavy way. It can also be in reminders of, in these stories, which I think really illustrate it, often by painting the opposite, which is by offering characters chances at immortality and seeing how, as much as that might feel like that would free us from an unbearable burden of death in our world, that there are different facets to that, and actually, especially as humans and as a human nature, that's not really what we were being called to, that there's something in us that yearns for our eternal home with God. And so in order to attain that, we have to embrace death. And that's why I thought, for a very basic, like I said, I don't want to sound like I'm doing it down, but I'm just saying it's not like a revolutionary film. It is just like a Disney movie.
It's a lovely little Disney live action.
Exactly. But I think it actually says something kind of actually just managing to be a little bit profound in it.
Yeah, I think the thing that actually makes it really, elevates it past, a little simpering love story, is the fact that it grapples with this topic, the fact that they don't end up together, that it inverts your expectation to a certain extent.
Yeah, and like you said, in the film there's a couple of quotes that stuck out to me. So the father, like you said, Angus Tuck, he says, "Don't be afraid of death, Winnie, be afraid of an unlived life." And I think that's where, again, we keep saying we're hinting at stuff that's coming down the road, but to me there's also two elements to the choice of immortality. And one is if you're looking for immortality, it's because you're sort of gorging on life and you want to get as much satisfaction and pleasure out of it, and you don't want to relinquish that in any way by growing old and dying. But then there's also the flip side, which is a fear of death, which leads you to live a very timid life because it's all framed by a fear of death. And those are very much two sides of the same coin. I don't think they're actually opposites. I think they're kind of intertwined, but they're two slightly different motivations in this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's framed with something that you touched on earlier, which is that the need to die to go on to our eternal home, that the reason this immortality hasn't appealed to us in the first place is because we are called to an immortal eternal life through death. We're not allowed to skip death to get there. Yeah. But that is what we're called to in the end. And it's rather looking for the cheat and looking to stay with what we know instead of to go on to what you don't know. Yeah, absolutely. And that obviously immortality is not necessarily something that's being offered to us. I think that there's a certain portion of the world's news that you come across of whether it's cryogenically freezing ourselves or whether it's whether we could live on in AI or something like that. That in some ways I am amazed at the genuine real life world applications of people not wanting to die and finding ways to extend their lives perpetually. Yeah, there is a certain obsession with that is actually a real life temptation.
Yeah, but for the most part it only really takes place in the form of fantasy novels. But it's through kind of fantasy stories that we're able to assess how the things that we might want for ourselves are also not necessarily the things that would actually bring us happiness. And so that's also in the film, that the young boy that she falls in love with, I think his first name is Jesse, isn't it? Yeah. The movie's called Tuck Everlasting, so I just
call them all Tuck.
They're all Tuck. But anyway, Jesse, the younger boy, his older brother has had the consequence of losing loved ones who hadn't drunk from the fountain of youth with him, who didn't choose that life, and him having a huge burden to do with that. And also just that sense of, like you were saying with the quote earlier, of feeling like you're stuck and feeling like you can't move on. And so I thought it was interesting how it highlighted that it's not all good. Although, I think it does a good job. I think for the most part, it does glamorize that family. They're a very happy, wholesome family. They live out in the woods and live this beautiful...
Oh, they're delightful.
beautiful life. It's absolutely tempting. If I were Winnie, I could definitely see the temptations of that just because of their specific situation.
Yeah, and she's also gotten a degree of freedom from her family and, the strictures around that. But that has kind of, even with all of that joy and freedom that she's getting there, she still chooses to live in the real world because their sorrow is still that they can't change. And what I also thought really important about the movie, but also about the book, is that it doesn't gloss over that fear of death either. In the book, it shows like Winnie realizing that she's going to die. Like that 11-year-old child kind of being confronted with that knowledge and automatically reacting, I don't want to die. And the response is no, not you. Of course you don't want to die, but it will come. And that it's part of the wheel that you can't pick out. You can't take death out of the equation and still have the rest of it. That her joy in their life is even somehow greater than their joy in the life because she's able to grow and change and they're not.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in some ways that comes to maybe the next point that kind of struck me, like drawing from another source, because I think when we're talking about death, there's a lot of, in some ways, caveats that are to be made, that I think when we're talking about it, there's a certain sense in which death is the burden of humanity. That's what we find in Genesis, that we don't get to live forever due to the fall. And yet there's within that greater degrees of tragedy. I think if we think about dying young, that's obviously a much greater tragedy. As much as, an elderly relative passing away, I absolutely know that feeling, that it's incredibly painful and hard to bear. But there is a propriety to it that isn't the same as a young person dying.
It's the end of a life lived well that is still a sorrow because, like you said, death is a result of the fall. Yeah. And it's not really clear whether, we'll go into it later as to whether or not there may have been some degree of that for unfallen man. Yeah. But that it's very clear that Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden after eating the fruit of good and evil so that they cannot eat of the tree of immortality as well, because it is only by dying that they can be saved. Yeah. That for them to go on immortal after sinning is for them to be stuck in that state of perpetual sin.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting because in that we're seeing death as it's two things at once. And so that brings us to Tolkien. And there was I think I referenced it on the podcast before, but there was a very famous interview with Stephen Colbert where he talks about the immense tragedy that he suffered in his own life with many of his family members dying at various times. And he is speaking about how that he was actually comforted by the words of Tolkien, specifically in a letter that he wrote, in which he says that a divine punishment is also a divine gift, if accepted, and that's a really key thing, if accepted, since its object is ultimate blessing, and the supreme inventiveness of the Creator will make punishments, that is, changes of design, produce a good not otherwise to be attained. And so I think Stephen Colbert sums it up in what punishments of God are not also gifts. And I think that's really interesting because it really plays into one of the themes that's really drawn out, especially in Tolkien's work in the Silmarillion, although I think it's present in all of his work. But he has this really interesting presentation because he has the elves who are immortal, and then he has the races of men who are not immortal. And as far from presenting that as men necessarily being a sort of lesser, he actually kind of presents it as being a greater calling. And in fact, he calls death the gift of man, that it's something that is actually, that Eru, the god character in Tolkien's world, has designated as a gift for this particular group of people. And he has a quote in here which says, "Death is their faith, the gift of Ilúvatar, which as time wears on even the powers shall envy. But Melkor has cast his shadow upon it, and confounded it with darkness, and brought forth evil out of good, and fear out of hope." Which is so interesting that it shows how it is both a gift and also a source of fear. At another time it says, "The doom of elves is to be immortal, to love the beauty of the world, to bring it to full flower with their gifts of delicacy and perfection, to last while it lasts, never leaving it even when slain, but returning, and yet, when the followers come, to teach them and make way for them, to fade as the followers grow, and to absorb the life from which they both proceed. The doom, or the gift of men, is mortality, freedom from the circles of the world.
That's so beautiful. I think you see a lot of the pain of that immortality in The Lord of the Rings, particularly in Lothlorien, as it's fading and it's the winter that spring will never come again.
Yeah.
Not being able to come back and cycle round is really sad.
Yeah, that there is a fixedness that they can't... Whatever happens with the world, they have to stay in the world.
And now you can't escape it.
Yeah, and now they may return to their homeland, which has less change associated with it, but they are still stuck in the world itself.
Yeah.
And that even if you go into the Silmarillion, there's a sense in which when they die, they actually go back to Valinor and are sort of regenerated in another way. Rather than dying and going on to the next realm.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's a very interesting and like complex, but uniquely in my view, sort of Tolkienian like expression of what this means, that he is trying to express that actually there is something that is good and even better than immortality in death, in that it allows us to enter into the presence of God.
Yeah, because I think without that hope, then death is only an evil.
Yeah.
Like, that's just a fact. But it's only with the hope of eternal life that these things become a good.
Yeah, and there was this really great article. I would actually recommend reading it in full. We're going to read out a few quotes of it, but it was
a few quotes.
It was a genuinely really great article. It's called "The Gift of Death" by Grant Sterling, and I think it's available online in PDF. It's part of, I think, the Mythlore journal, but like I said, it's just available online in a PDF. But
it'll be in the show notes.
That is correct. I will link it in the show notes. But it was funny because, like Phoebe said, I was pulling out quotes from it and then I'm just like highlighting the entire article and pasting it into my notes. And he does such a good job of bringing together all of these strands within Tolkien's work. And so he says, as Tolkien saw it, although God intends that we love the world, the messengers from Valinor to Númenor also say, the love of Arda was set in your hearts by Ilúvatar, and he does not plant to no purpose. Yet he also intends that we see death in its appropriate time as a blessing, for through it we may escape the world and serve him in other ways and receive from him a greater reward. The immortals do not die, but it is also true that they are bound to the world for better and for worse. Mortal men must die and venture into the unknown, but they should see that Ilúvatar does not do anything without a purpose. And it's interesting because, as he points out, and I've read in a couple of other places, that there's one point in which Tolkien said that in terms of The Lord of the Rings, the story is less actually about power and power seeking, which is how a lot of us would characterize it. But he actually says it is mainly concerned with death and immortality and a sort of obsession with deathlessness. And I think that's really interesting because it plays into, like we were saying, with the elves and even the men, but also the willingness to risk yourself for a greater cause.
Yeah, the willingness to risk death. But then also, I think we were going to talk about the impact that unnaturally extending life in The Lord of the Rings, that it's the evil twist that's put on death that men might fear it, then becomes the lure that the evil side uses to sway people to them. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think it's interesting, like, we'll start with the Silmarillion, because obviously that's so much based on the stories of Númenor, which are, if you know much about your kind of pre-Lord of the Rings mythology,
which I don't,
they are the elevated race of men, the one that are kind of specially chosen, and they live within the site of Valinor in this island of Númenor. But they, even though they have greatly extended lives, they become kind of angry and frustrated and try to seize immortality by force by sailing to the undying lands. And this causes Atlantis-like the doom of both their people and their home.
Yeah, which is such an inversion of the gift that was given specifically to them, which we see in Aragorn in the appendices.
Yeah.
Which is the gift of the ability to lay down their life at the right time in like almost a Christ-like way, that they give up their life at the time that it's called, like very specifically at the time that they're called to do so.
Yeah.
But that it's theirs to give up, and it's only when they refuse to do that and hold on to it that they slip into madness and descend from that high standing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that the point is this sense of seizing. And so it's interesting because in the mix of all of this in the Silmarillion is Sauron, who is actually egging on the Númenóreans at this point. And so in the article, The Gifts of Death, the author points out that Sauron saw the fear of death, which was the legacy of the time of Morgoth, still lingered on in lesser men, and so he was able to seduce them to his aid by offering immortality. Indeed, as a sign that the shadow was growing even upon Númenor, 3 of his new ringwraiths were Númenorian lords. But the gift of immortality was a sham. They had, as it seemed, unending life, yet life became unbearable to them. The natural span of human life could be artificially lengthened by the rings of power, but it did not bring joy to its long-lived recipients.
That's such a powerful contrast to put the ringwraiths beside the elves as like 2 immortal beings.
Yeah.
One which have this gift naturally, and the other which has seized it.
Yeah, absolutely. Tolkien has this great sense of that there is a fitting amount of time for each of the creations of the world. And I think we all know that Bilbo line of like, I feel like butter stretched over too much bread.
I love that line.
And that, you know, once that time is at its end, once you've stretched it out as far as it really can go, that it is almost impossible to draw joy out of life. And we really see that with Gollum. Like, he gets the ring, he gets to live for hundreds of years, and all he does is sit at the bottom of the mountain, stroking his ring and catching fish. What are you getting out of all of this time? And it's essentially nothing.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a key point here, which is, how are you using the time that's given to you? And the challenge of using it well.
Yeah.
And part of using it well means not letting that fear of death override your decisions.
Yeah, absolutely.
That it is taken as a part of life and not thought, but not like ran away from either.
Yeah, and that there is a sense in which that there is a real detriment in this kind of sense of trying to dupe or seize or artificially lengthen or draw out or work against the natural span of life. And I think to move from Tolkien to his friend Lewis, as we are wont on Risky Enchantment to do, I think it was you, Phoebe, who reminded me of how this is picked up really wonderfully in The Magician's Nephew.
Well, it's so tied in with when we were talking about the fall and the the Tree of Life that it just had to come.
It springs to mind, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
So, I mean, maybe if you want to remind for the context for this in The Magician's Nephew.
Sure. So, in The Magician's Nephew, the 2 children, Diggory and Polly, have gone first to a world called Charn, where they found this evil witch who destroyed that world and has preserved herself immortally. And then they end up through a cycle of things in Narnia at its beginning, as it's being sung into being. And that's how the witch gets to Narnia.
Which I think is such an interesting element of how like evil is brought into the world, that like even at the very beginning, you know, evil is present. Even just as Aslan is creating this new perfect world, there is already evil present in it by just the workings of whatever it is, fate or
by human error and human sinfulness.
Perhaps, yeah, that sounds about right. And so, yeah, I think the witch flees into the countryside.
Yeah, so she flees from Aslan and then she finds this essentially the Garden of Eden, on a mountain, and Diggory and Polly are sent to get an apple from the Tree of Life to plant to protect Narnia from her. And they find her eating one of these apples.
Yeah. And playing in the background of all of this is the fact that Diggory, his mother, is dying at home back on Earth.
Yeah.
And he's been upset and frustrated and worried about this the whole time. And so he hears about this apple of youth. He hears that he's in the land of youth. He's like, it is constantly playing on his mind that like perhaps there's a way to help his mother.
Yeah, and the witch really kind of plays on that and tries to get him to take the apple that he's supposed to be bringing back to Narnia to just go home, which he can do, because only in this book do they actually have the power to jump back and forth themselves. And yeah, so he's tempted to go home and resists that temptation and gives up on the idea. But then the whole thing is being explained to them. And Aslan explains that because she's eaten this apple, that the rest are all now horror to her. And that is what happens of those who pluck and eat fruit at the wrong time and in the wrong way. The fruit is good, but they loathe it ever after. And Polly then asks, I suppose because she took it in the wrong way, it won't work for her. I mean, it won't make her always young and all that. Alas, says Aslan, shaking his head, it will. These things always work according to their nature. She has won her heart's desire. She has unwearying strength and endless days like a goddess. But length of days with an evil heart is only length of misery, and already she begins to know it. All get what they want, they do not always like it. I think that's such a powerful representation even of like this great magic user who has been empress of her own world for so long and now has, you know, gotten what she always thought would be her heart's desire. And yet, because of the evil in her heart and the evil way in which she went about it, that will only be an increasing burden to her. And even then, as the books progress, that you kind of see her having to like fade and diminish and being cast out again and again. And almost that her not dying but coming back, being less powerful and having to like fight her way back as a snake even.
Yeah.
There's that kind of built into the book of that sorrow.
And even I think it's really interesting because then, you know, Diggory kind of plucks up the courage to ask Aslan about his mother and what would have happened if he had
That's so powerful.
taken the apple as he was tempted to do. And Aslan says, understand then that it would have healed her, but not to your joy or hers. The day would have come when both you and she would have looked back and said it would have been better to die in that illness. And Diggory could say nothing, for tears choked him, and he gave up all hopes of saving his mother's life. But at the same time he knew that the lion knew what would have happened, and that there might be things, more terrible even, than losing someone you love by death. But now Aslan was speaking again, almost in a whisper. That is what would have happened, child, with a stolen apple. It is not what will happen now. What I give you now will bring joy. It will not, in your world, give endless life, but it will heal. Go, pluck her an apple from the tree.
And that tree being the tree that has grown from the apple that he planted. Not, so like, it's the fruit of the fruit, not the apple itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so interesting that there's such I think such a true representation of the mercy of God, which is that gifts are offered to you, you can't seize them, but that there is a mercy of gift. And it really reminds me, I think it was in one of the readings, I think maybe yesterday, or maybe it was just in morning prayer, I can't remember, but it was the line from the Gospels of Jesus and the leper, and he, you know, if you want to, you can heal me. And Jesus replies, of course I want to heal you. And I think that's such a powerful line, and it doesn't mean that there is ever any guarantee of, you know, medical healing on earth. It can happen, it does happen, it happens through medicine and it happens through prayer, and it can happen in a variety of ways, but it's not guaranteed. And yet at the same time, there is a sense in which we're seeing here that it is good to be healed, and that healing is possible, and we should rejoice and celebrate it and seek it where it is possible.
Yeah, that it is good to live our lives to their fullest extent through the permission of medicine and the healing of God. We're not by any means saying by this that you shouldn't extend your life by medicine.
Yeah.
But that at the same time, you also see with Diggory having to give up the apple in the first place, that the sacrifice comes first. Just as death comes before eternal life, the sacrifice comes before the gift of healing is given.
Yeah. And in a sense, having to hand it over to God, having to relinquish your own sense of control over a situation before you can actually receive the gifts. And I think it's interesting because what happens is that, Diggory's mother is healed of this illness. But as Aslan says, it's not going to give her endless life. She is going to have a death. It'll come later. It'll come at what we might perhaps call a more appropriate time, and after a longer life, after more time spent with her son. But it will come. And so there's a sense in which there has to be that we're being asked to cultivate a proper attitude to death, which is to neither treat it totally cavalierly and like it doesn't matter, and as if death isn't a tragedy, and that as if we shouldn't forestall it, and yet at the same time to see a life lived well as a blessing, and the ability to then lay down at the end of a life and say that was enough and I'm ready to go to God.
Yeah, and it's not about eking every drop of of pleasure out of this life because I'm going to die anyway.
Yeah.
But in some ways being ready for death that we might enter eternal life.
Yeah, and having a sense of having a well-ordered attitude towards death, which helps us to embrace it and embrace what God is offering us both here and in the next life. And I think that kind of brings us back actually to Tolkien, because we mentioned it earlier. There's a sort of interesting section at the end of, it's in the appendices at the end of The Lord of the Rings, where we get the story of Aragorn and Arwen. And I think especially reading it at first glance with our current modern lens, I think it can be a little bit daunting, because Arwen gives up her immortal life in order to be with Aragorn, who then lives for a very long number of years because he has truly embraced his Númenórean heritage to be this sort of higher form of man. But he does die. And as you mentioned, Phoebe, I think something that sort of, from a Catholic perspective, and knowing that Tolkien was a Catholic, reading it can kind of set our hair on end, which is that he talks about setting down at his own choice. And it says,
Aragorn says to Arwen, "Take counsel with yourself, beloved, and ask whether you indeed have me wait until I wither and fall from my high seat, witless and unmanned. Nay, lady, I am the last of the Númenóreans, and the last king of the elder days. And to me has been given not only a span thrice that of men of Middle Earth, but also the grace to go at my will and give back the gift. Now, therefore, I will sleep."
And I think at first glance, there's a part of me that feels anxious about reading that, because it almost sounds like an apology for euthanasia. That would you like to see me become old and withered and not be the powerful man that I once was, and that instead I'm going to choose to die now. And certainly if we are to read it that way, which I think we're going to go on and highlight that's actually, as much as that's what it might seem like at first glance, that's actually not at all what Tolkien is saying here. He's actually playing on something which is a little bit more nuanced. And first of all, it's that when you understand him in the context of his Númenórean ancestors, who, like we've said, have this precedence of saying it's never enough. I need to hold on to power. I need to hold on to life forever as much as possible, and every kind of curtailing of that is an imposition on me, and I will fight against it to the extent of violating the laws of God. I think if you're reading it with that point of view, you're saying no, he's choosing to not hold on to power for as long as possible, to not extend beyond what is actually rightfully his time. But there's an even kind of further element of it, which I'm going to give full props to Phoebe, who, when we were listening to this on audiobook recently, immediately called it out, saying, I feel like that's kind of a reference to this.
To Unfallen Man?
Yeah.
Yeah. To me, it feels a little bit like one of the trains of thought that isn't a doctrine of the church by any means, but is a speculation of theology, that death to Unfallen Man may have been that he could give up his life to go on to higher things, to be with God. And the more tangible reference that we have to that is in the Assumption of Our Lady finishing her time here on earth and being drawn up to heaven.
Yeah.
Giving up her life here on earth to go on.
Yeah.
And the most important thing is that it's a perspective of going on and choosing to move forward, and accepting the sacrifice that comes with it, which is the giving up of one's life.
Yeah, and he actually specifically references the Assumption in one of his letters. I'm not sure whether he ever actually sent the letter. I could be wrong. It might have been one of his unsent letters, but he added a note later to sort of expand on this, about saying, the Assumption of Mary, the only unfallen person, may be regarded as in some ways a simple regaining of unfallen grace and liberty. She asked to be received and was, having no further function on earth. Though, of course, even if unfallen, she was not pre-fall. Her destiny, in which she had cooperated, was far higher than that of any man would have been, had the fall not occurred. It was also unthinkable that her body, the immediate source of our Lord, without other physical intermediary, should have been disintegrated or corrupted, nor could it surely be long separated from him after the ascension. There is, of course, no suggestion that Mary did not age at the normal rate of her race, but certainly that this process cannot have proceeded or been allowed to proceed to the decrepitude of loss or vitality and comeliness. The Assumption was in any case as distinct from the Ascension as the raising of Lazarus from the self-resurrection. So what he's saying there is just that Mary in that way should be the model for how we're understanding this. And I think it's very key that he's talking about how having no further function to serve, because in some ways I think we think of function as productivity and what we can contribute, but that function can also be the conduit through which people receive grace. And I think when we're thinking of euthanasia, there's a sense in which you're cutting off the ability for people to serve you, for people to be in your life and minister to you as you're going through the end of your journey. Yeah,
because I think the thing that maybe is a little bit difficult here in terms of what we see of people with old age is that he's saying of her not like falling into decrepitude and Aragorn not falling into decrepitude. And yet, as Catholics, we also firmly believe that for normal people, accepting that fall into decrepitude, if that is what you're called to, and allowing people to serve you in it for as long as you are called to be in this world.
Yeah.
And it's the difference between keeping the gift for as long as it is given for, and not selfishly casting it away yourself, but being ready to offer it up at the proper time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is, it's such a difficult tension to hold and talk about.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important to say that it's both.
Yeah, and that I think Tolkien would also agree with us on this. I don't think we're. I have confidence in Tolkien's Catholic understanding of things, but I do think he is pulling out something really interesting, which is the sense in which things can be ordered to a proper time. There was one of the points we had Holly Ordway on the show a year ago now. I can't even remember, but she was talking about her book Tolkien's Modern Reading, and how there's a quote from Tolkien in it about how he actually really enjoyed seeing the Peter Pan play, as it was a play first before it was a novel, and he definitely liked it, but there was a sense in which he was a little bit concerned with the way it sort of shirked the darker themes that were introduced into it, and he I think it's actually Lewis who coined the term Peter Pantheism, which is that sense of never growing up and never getting old. And actually, I think he potentially took issue with the line that Peter Pan has, which is that, to die would be an awfully great adventure. And we're going to contrast that with another quote that seems almost identical, but is actually in a slightly different context. Because I think what Tolkien is taking issue with there is a sense of being cavalier about death when you're too young to reckon with the tragedy that it would be at that stage of your journey. That it is a bad thing for young people to die. And I think Tolkien, having gone through World War I, particularly, I think more so for World War I than World War II, because they had the precedents of World War I behind them. World War I, the young men were sent off with this sort of boyish, gallant hope that it was going to be a jolly good adventure, and maybe some of them would die, but, overall it was going to be an awfully big adventure. And what they were presented with was a killing machine in which they were thrown into as sort of fodder. And it was an awful, destructive way of viewing life, that whatever you might think about various necessities of it, but the sense in which it wasn't an adventure, it was just another number on a sheet or another person down the line, that they stopped being human. And I think he had a real issue with seeing death in this sort of cavalier way from a young person's perspective.
Yeah, and I think it's also tied in with maybe the story not grappling with the darker side of what it means to not grow up to a full extent. He comments that children are meant to grow up and die and not to become Peter Pans. And the key, like you were saying, with that young person dying, the key is to grow up.
Yeah.
And then to die at the end of that is the goal.
Yeah.
Or like the proper place for it. And obviously tragedies do happen. But yeah, as we were saying, it is more tragic for a young person to die.
Yeah.
And that has to be grappled with. But there's also, I think, C.S. Lewis talks about this as well, of younger people being more willing to do the courageous things and risk their lives in it, which can go too far in the case of World War I. But also as you get older, the knowledge of your own mortality can kind of like eat into that courage and eat away at it in a way that means maybe not taking enough risks or being too careful of your own life and too afraid of death.
It's the part that we read out from Azan, which is saying that there might be something worse than the death of a loved one at any stage. And so, as much as we might say we're kind of ranking tragedies, but that it is not always the case that death is the absolute worst thing that can happen. And yet it is not something that should be taken flippantly. And so the sort of parallel quote that I mentioned earlier that I wanted to pull out was actually from Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, where they're talking about Nicholas Flamel and giving up the Philosopher's Stone and destroying it, and Harry being like, but doesn't that mean he will die? And Dumbledore says, to one as young as you, I'm sure it seems incredible, but to Nicholas and Perinell, it really is like going to bed after a very, very long day. After all, to the well-organised mind, death is but the next great adventure. In some ways, that's almost exactly the same words as Peter Pan. But the point is it comes at the end of a very long life. And perhaps even it's, you could read the slight suggestion, an overly long life, like a Bilbo or a Gollum.
Stretched life. That it comes to finally being allowed to lie down and sleep and change into death.
Yeah, and that having been given the gift of the stone in some capacity, the courage to then give it up, to say I have it, but will I keep it?
Yeah.
And that in some ways it can be then a release, like they said, to lie down after a very, very long day. Yeah,
and there's he finishes that quote with, the stone was not really such a wonderful thing. As much money in life as you could want. The two things most human beings would choose above all. The trouble is, humans do have a knack of choosing precisely those things which are worst for them.
Yeah.
Which is, it's tied back into that idea of Tuck Everlasting, because part of the story of Tuck Everlasting is then protecting the Fountain of Life from the multitudes who would just run for it.
Yeah. And that's in The Magician's Nephew as well, which is Uncle Andrew, who's also there at the beginning of the world, says, "The Fountain of Youth, I could make so much money out of it. I could build a spa." And so much so he doesn't even think of his sister, Diggory's mother, who's dying. That he's like,
no, why would he think of that?
Don't be ridiculous. There's money to be made. So there is that sense in which, that these things do kind of corrupt us, and that actually there's a sense of being properly ordered to the amount of time that we're given, and that we're called to live in a particular time. And I think actually to bring it back to Tolkien, but in a very different story, I just want to, it's not really about immortality. It is kind of about death. He has a short story called Leaf by Niggle.
We've done an awful lot of stories, but it's great.
It's a great one. And I don't know, I almost feel like I should devote a whole episode to it. But
maybe we will someday.
Maybe we will. But it's a sort of, I don't want to use the word allegory, because I feel like Tolkien would come and haunt me forever for suggesting
an allegory.
for suggesting that he wrote an allegory. But it's about a really interesting theme of how, as an artist, a slight aside, we're just the Oscars are just over, and one of the films nominated for that was The Banshees of Inisherin, and which was directed by Martin McDonagh, who we talked about in the episode on 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. But I didn't find this particular film as compelling, because I think he actually introduces the very themes that Leaf by Niggle suggests, but he doesn't really actually go anywhere with them. And these themes are, is it better to invest time into being an artist and creating something that will give good things to the world? Or is it better to be good to your neighbours and kind and nice, and all of the way that in some ways it's very difficult to do both? You can either devote all of your time to one thing, or you can constantly answer the interruptions of another. But
you can be a nice person or a great artist.
Maybe. I don't want to go that far. And what Tolkien does from his Catholic point of view is take it a step further, and then shows how you can do both, and how it's actually necessary to do both, and also that how you can never actually fulfill your, I guess, artistic potential in life, and that you have to trust it to God to see its full flourishing. So the story is about a guy called Niggle who is trying to paint, and he's painting a tree, and he's spending all of this time on like a leaf and building it up leaf by leaf. And it's a sort of strange fairy tale fantasy world in which they know that he has to take a journey, which is obviously death at the end, and he has to prepare, and there's a whole thing about having your garden in order. And his neighbor Parish, who's constantly annoying him and asking him for things, and and as he's coming to the end of his life, as his journey is approaching, Niggle is desperately trying to finish his painting, and Parish is like, "Oh, there's a storm, and my the tiles have fallen off my roof, and my wife is sick, and I need you to go get a doctor." And at that moment, Niggle has to choose between serving his neighbor and trying to, at least making a vague attempt at finishing his work. And to me, it's really interesting in this idea of death, in that there is a certain amount of time that is allotted to him, and that it's up to us to try and make that balance within the time that we have. And then, as we were saying with Aragorn, to lay down your tools. There is a sense in which you have to stop and lay them down.
Yeah, there's a great point where he's kind of like, his picture's growing and growing and growing. He's tacking on canvas here and there. And part of his way to try and find more time for it in his head is to say, "I wish I was more strong-minded," he sometimes said to himself, meaning that he wished other people's troubles did not make him feel uncomfortable. But for a long time he was not seriously perturbed. "At any rate, I shall get this one picture done, my real picture, before I have to go on that wretched journey," he used to say. And yet he was beginning to see that he could not put off his start indefinitely. The picture would have to stop growing and get finished.
And as I said, it doesn't get finished. And in fact, in many ways, it sort of gets dismantled. But when he passes through to this afterlife, and there's more to it than just that he ends up in a nice place. There's quite a lot of interesting moments in that journey that's referenced. But it says, "Before him stood the tree, his tree, finished. If you could say that of a tree that was alive, its leaves opening, its branches growing and bending in the wind, that Nigel had so often felt or guessed, and had so often failed to catch. He gazed at his tree, and slowly he lifted his arms and opened them wide. "It is a gift," he said. He was referring to his art, and also to the result, but he was using the word quite literally. He went on looking at the tree. All the leaves that he had ever laboured at were there, as he had imagined them, rather than as he had made them. And there were others there that had only budded in his mind, and many that might have budded, if only he had had the time. Nothing was written on them, but they were just exquisite leaves, yet they were dated as clear as a calendar. And I don't think I actually have the full quote there, but it goes on to say that actually there's also an element of the tree that inexplicably speaks of his neighbour Parish. That there's something in the tree that is itself influenced by Parish and his relationship with Parish. And then
that's so interesting.
And then as Parish comes to the afterlife, this kind of afterlife that Tolkien is imagining, that the two of them then sort of collaborate together.
It's really cute.
And it's so interesting. I'd really recommend that you read it, but that it shows how, even as much as you can think as an artist that it's up to me to find all the time and to cut myself off from the world, but that actually embracing the world is the thing that helps this art flourish, but also that there is no way for Nigel to have seen the full fruits of this work without the grace of God, that it's only in the afterlife that we see its full flourishing, and that he couldn't have achieved it by himself on earth.
Yeah, he's seeing the mountains in the backdrop that he hadn't even gotten as far as imagining properly yet.
Yeah.
That there is that completion to it given in the afterlife, which is just such a beautiful representation for any attempt at art in this life.
Yeah.
That the completion is there in heaven waiting for us. And
I think it's interesting how it's funny how there's so many trees involved in this. We're
Tolkien loves his trees.
This is true, but we start with the tree of the trees in the Garden of Eden, and then we've got the tree in...
Well, actually, we started with the tree in Tuck Everlasting, because the Fountain of Youth comes from the base of a tree.
This is true. So it feels like the whole cycle of this is bound up in trees. But actually, to take one more step further into a story that isn't about trees at all, but I think...
We'll find a tree now.
I think is it a very interesting way to sum up the end of this discussion, which is to talk about a film called About Time. And this is one where I definitely want to flag a spoiler. I was saying this to Phoebe. I know I do try to flag spoilers when we're talking about things.
Usually. We failed with Tuck Everlasting earlier. Sorry about that.
But I think partly one of the reasons we failed is that I don't necessarily feel like the sort of hyperbole around spoilers is really necessary. I don't think it often detracts from a story to necessarily know where it's going. But this is a story in which it's not so much that there's a plot twist or something like that, but it just handles the arc of this story in a very unexpected way. And so I would really recommend you watch it. Like I said, it's called About Time. I think it's a Richard Curtis film. It's in that very classic English rom-com style. It actually feels like it carries some of the charm of the sort of 90s rom-coms through to the modern day. I really like it. But as much as it starts off as a rom-com, it goes on to be more about a meditation about life and how to live life, because it has this... It's in many ways just, like I said, a straightforward rom-com, but it has this plot device in which, and it goes unexplained, the main character Tim is told at the start by his father that all of the men in his family line can travel through time.
Specifically that they can jump back to any point of their past life, and essentially brain swap back to there, change something, and then jump back to where they were again.
Or just keep living.
Or keep living if they choose, but they can go either way.
Yeah. And like I said, there isn't like a whole world building around it. The mechanism is go into a dark place and close your eyes and you'll find yourself where you need to be.
That wasn't the spoiler.
That's not the spoiler. That's introduced at the very start. But the way it deals with this plot point is actually very interesting. Like I said, it's not necessarily about immortality, although I'm sure you could rig that system to keep going back in a loop so that you just keep living forever and ever. But it has a very interesting kind of twist to this. And this is where maybe I would say, if you're really keen to see this,
it's a great movie.
I would really recommend it. Maybe just skip. This is the last thing we're talking about. So either if you want to finish the episode earlier, I don't mind, but you can skip until we're talking about what we're enjoying at the moment and all those things. But this is the last section that we're talking about. But it has a really interesting twist, which is that once you have a child, that essentially kind of curtails your ability to go back in time, because
you essentially unmake the child.
Yeah, essentially. And so there is a sort of limitation to when you can go back to. And so at some point in the story, Tim has to decide whether he wants to be able to keep continuing to go into his past to a certain time, to a certain event, or to spend time with a particular person. Or he can choose to have another child with his wife and hope for the future.
Yeah, which is where we really tied into this, that it's about choosing the future and choosing that change over the ability to keep going back to the past and gleaning more from it.
Yeah, and that, you know, at some point he has to let go of this enchanted past or enchanted stasis, like you could say, almost like the static nature of immortality, and that you can always go back and do whatever you like. Or you can choose the future and you can choose to hope for better things and let go of the gifts that were in the past that are now gone from your life. And it's so beautiful, it's so moving. And there's also a quote, which again isn't really a spoiler, but I just think it's such a lovely treatment. But I do think it's wonderful to hear it first in the movie. But if you do know the movie, or if you don't mind that much, here's the quote. It's Tim's father teaching him how to actually fully get the most out of this power. And so Tim, it's in a voiceover, says, "And so he told me the secret formula for happiness. Part 1 of the 2-part plan was that I should just get on with ordinary life, living it day by day, like anyone else. But then came part 2 of Dad's plan. He told me to live every day, again, almost exactly the same. The first time with all the tensions and worries that stop us noticing how sweet the world can be. But the second time, noticing. And in the end, I think I've learned the final lesson from my travels in time. And I've even gone one step further than my father did. The truth is, I now don't travel back at all, not even for the day. I just try to live every day as if I've deliberately come back to this one, to enjoy it. As if it were the full final day of my extraordinary, ordinary life."
I love that. It's so full of that, like, carpe diem, seize the day, and yet also fully accepting of human limitation.
Yeah, and in some ways, isn't it such a, like, positive spin on Memento Mori? Mm-hmm. That, like I said at the start, we're just coming to the end of Lent, but isn't that such a beautiful way to embrace Memento Mori, to live your life as if you were coming back to that moment to absolutely savor it and embrace the gifts that are in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to not be running away from the fear of what might be up ahead, that you're not letting anxieties and worries and fears interrupt your ability to receive the blessings of that day.
Yeah, that you're living it as if you'd come back to just live it again to enjoy it.
Yeah. It's a beautiful film. I would really recommend it. I almost got a little bit teary reading that quote. Yeah. So I hope this was, as we said, a relatively light-hearted but interesting discussion on death.
And I think we also wanted to give, just before we go on to what we're enjoying at the moment, we want to give a shout out to one of Katie Marquette's podcasts on Born of Wonder. It was one of her earliest episodes, but it's also kind of around this theme of, like, making the best of the time you have now, which is her Groundhog Day episode. I think it's episode 4 of her very first season, but I would go and check that out.
Yeah, it was really lovely. So yeah, definitely. We often play on the same themes. I've just seen that she's just released an episode on Irish saints. So clearly we're thinking on parallel lines. I'll need to reach out to her and see how she's she's getting on and maybe have her back on the podcast. I guess the only thing left is also to say, I hope you have a very happy Easter and a holy week and all of those things that are just on the horizon when this podcast comes out.
And a very productive end of Lent and joyful celebration, seizing the day.
Absolutely. So, as we mentioned, Phoebe, what are you enjoying at the moment?
Well, I just finished a book called Good Evening, Mrs. Craven, which is the wartime stories of Molly Panter Downs, and it's a Persephone book publication, which is lovely. But it's just a collection of short war stories from the Second World War of the people at home. And it's just a lovely kind of insight into human nature, quite interesting, and they're all quite different.
Yeah.
So I enjoyed that. And I'm also enjoying a podcast called The Thing About Austen, which takes a dive into like some niche aspect of Jane Austen's world each week and kind of explains the context of that to help like flesh out the novels.
Yeah, wonderful.
So it's great fun.
For myself, I was saying to Phoebe, I don't know what I've been enjoying at the moment. I've actually been a bit poorly. By the time
she's finally alive again.
I went to the doctor, and as we said, the benefits of medicine and the blessings that can be. But by the time this comes out, I should be back from a holiday. So please God, that will have gone well. If it has, you'll hear about it in the following episode. But I don't know just yet. So I guess, I don't know, what am I enjoying at the moment?
Chitty Chitty Bang Bang?
Yeah, we watched Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. I did enjoy that a lot. I haven't seen it in quite a while. I thought it was super fun. The costumes are gorgeous. The music is great. So yeah, I think that'll be my thing I've been enjoying at the moment.
There we go.
And other than that, all the usual, you can follow the podcast on Instagram, Risking Enchantment Podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at Seeking Watson. You can sign up to our newsletter on the website, and all of the links will be in the description. And all that's left to say is thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.
Goodbye.
This has been Risking Enchantment. Music by Kevin MacLeod. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @SeekingWatson. And you can find out more about me and the podcast at rachelsherlock.com. Thank you and God bless.